participants. We have a reasonable number already, 52.
Apologies for the technical glitch. There was just a power cut on my side.
Oh, power cut. Okay.
Yeah.
We had a power cut here, and the Wi-Fi was off for 1 hour. So I was going, I was going to send a message, keep alternative arrangements.
Yeah, but we are recording now, and we are also live on YouTube, so we can start the seminar.
Okay.
Okay, Manu, you can start now.
All right. Welcome to the ICS webinar. Just a little while ago, everybody was talking about the COVID infections. We are still seeing spike in India, in US, in so many places. But a few things are still going on. We are undeterred. And what we are discussing, of course, has a lot to do with the current situation as well. It so happens that we had started the webinar series with a presentation on mobile workers, mobile livelihood, in fact, on migrant workers in China. And we have had a couple of related things. And today it's a very interesting topic, specific and interesting. The specific dimension of the migrant labor situation is who recruits them. So the title is Conscripting Kinsmen. T.G. Suresh has given this topic, Conscripting Kinsmen. And migrant workers and peasant workers labor contractors and peasant workers in India and China. So these labor contractors are our reference point today, because I think the literature has put only a very limited focus on that. So we are grateful that Suresh has focused on this aspect. T.G. Suresh, Center for Political Studies, JNU, and honorary fellow or adjunct fellow, I forget now, but a very keen member of ICS Society and one of the very important China scholars who works on labor, migration, urbanization, and is just back after a Fulbright senior fellowship at Cornell. And he has been working on this topic. So Suresh, welcome back to India. And you have overcome the effects of the quarantine by now, I am sure. And, and we look forward to a very interesting discussion. Suresh, you will speak for about 30-35 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And then we will have 3 discussants. We'll make brief 2 to 3 minute comments and ask questions. P.K. Anand of ICS, our research associate, ICS, who has worked on, industries and labor in China and also India. Then we'll have Rija Nair, a recent PhD, also who works on labor. And Umi Daniel, he used to be with Oxfam, now he's in Bhubaneswar, leading the migrant labor support activities. He's the director of Migrant Labor Research Center in Bhubaneswar. After that, we'll open it for discussion. I may interject with a few questions myself sometimes. Okay, over to you, Suresh.
Yeah, happy to be back. Thank you, ICS, Ambassador Ashok and Professor Mohanty for having me today. And I realized that it's a long story, the Conscripting Kinsmen, but I will focus now more on China and then say, of course, make a parallel reference to India. To begin with, this is a phenomenon, the labor contractors, for most of the labor historians working on India, China, and many other societies. And we have seen in the early phase of industrialization in both in India and in particularly in China, labor workers came primarily from a rural agrarian background, or they were basically, say, rural persons looking for employment in, say, whichever sectors which gave them, say, any wage work. So from the say late say Qing period to the early 20th century, and up until, say, Chinese revolution, the last phase of the revolution, we have now, say, enough say descriptive details about how the labor contract system came into effect in China. And to identify the main characteristics of the labor contract system in China, there are certain, say, early industrial sectors such as coal mines, especially the Kuailai coal mines in Hebei province, Anyuan in Jiangxi, Henan border areas, and then coal mines in Yunnan, and also, say, cotton mills in, say, Shanghai 1920s and 1930s, owned both by the British and the Japanese. And also there are the transport workers in the city of Tianjin and many other cities. And we also have the metal working trade in a place called Santiaoshe in Tianjin, where there is this elaborate say work done by, say, Gail Hershatter. From all this, we can see what was the labor contracting system, which was typically this. A labor agent or a labor contractor usually travel to rural areas. And this is a picture that is given to us by, say, in the, Chesnow's early work on Chinese trade union. A labor contractor traveled to rural areas and then, say, visits villages and send homes and persuade and nudge families to send their daughters and young children to work in cotton factories in Shanghai. And they enter into, and then labor contractor will enter into a contract with the family for a 3 to 4 years contract. And then, say, these young children, mainly girls, are brought to the Shanghai cotton mills, where they are provided temporary accommodation, and then the contractor will retain roughly 40% of the wages. And then in the case of mining, we have, if not all workers are, say, mobilized from the rural areas, a majority of the workers in many of the coal mine towns, where they came from the rural areas of adjoining in places. But but we will also see that in case of China, labor contracts were also a very, very different kind of a social actors. They were not simply, say, agents of a, say, factory management or coal management. They were also well connected to the traditional, the brotherhood system in China, like the Green Gang in Shanghai, and a brotherhood in Anyuan called the Elder Brother Society or the Red Gang. So this was a gangster network, very violent. Members of the gangster network were sworn, brothers. They have allegiance to their leader, deity, and so we have a convergence between pre-existing traditional, secret societies, modern, say, gangster network, labor contracting, all, together. So it is easy to imagine how difficult it would have been for anybody to resist the labor contractors' firm grip over the rural peasantry. I mean, especially those who came as workers in coal mine towns and etc. I mean, some of the details are very interesting because more often these labor contractors tied to the brotherhood and gangster network, they recruit people from their own, say villages they are very familiar with, kind of say provinces, they have a more say, kinship networks, etc. That's the reason why I'm using kinship as in an extended sense. It can be extended from your own, kinship to a village, to a much larger area. And we can also see that, and by the way, to make a slight diversion, and in the context of the 19th century modern industry and labor, this is not anything strange. We have already seen that in the case of, say, 19th century British agriculture, the system of the gang masters were already well known, and also the case of, say, the Chinese Qing dynasty, Chinese coolie trade, the Indian, the term that we are not familiar with, coolie, it seems it is derived from the Chinese term coolie. And then the coolie trade was also used to labor contractors in a more violent manner, equal to something like the Atlantic slave trade, where agents of companies will be going to the rural areas and then trick and deceive rural peoples, often use violence, and then then bring them to the the shipping centers, and etc. etc. So the point is, in the context of that, in that time, this kinds of a labor mobilization and recruitment was not very strange. And in South Asia, we know that from India to many say migrant labor. In case of South India, we have the the Kangani as a labor contractor, and the Sardar in the Assam tea plantation, then mysteries, then the old, say, Jamadar, Tekhdar, we have in India. So the interesting part that it was the early industrialization phase. In select industrial sectors, there emerged a peculiar say labor mobilization system. The kingpin of the system was a labor contractor who, of course, recruit say workers for the coal management, the cotton mill management, or in transport sector, but at the same time exercised greater control over the life of these people, not only by, say, deducting wages from them, but also say dominating the entire aspects of labor process, in the sense that both the factory management, both the cotton factory managers or management of a Japanese or a British or even Chinese, they relied heavily on this recruiting, gangster network to not only to recruit workers, but also to increase production and also to insulate themselves from any of the social costs which arises from having large numbers of workers. So all process of disciplining thing, you have this very typical labor old style so that image of an unfree labor, where a gang master will be whipping the workers to work more, increase production. That kind of system was actually happening in the coal pits of Anyuan and and also in many other places. But in case of Shanghai, the 30% of the entire Shanghai, say workers, cotton workers were, contract workers, who were all of them were women. That major work by, say, Emily Honig, Sisters and Strangers, the women in Shanghai cotton mills, that provide, and subsequently by, say, Elizabeth Perry's work on Shanghai strike, we have, say, more details about how this system, was emerging. So in a sense, a labor contractor, or or a labor boss, or a gang boss, or a labor agent, and one term in Chinese we come across is a Pao Kung Tao. Pao Kung labor, Tao, head, the labor contractor. And these Pao Kung Taos are actually not only a de facto employer, but also, a kind of a mentor, sometimes, of course, sometimes he's the one who will responsible for disciplining the entire, the labor force. And, in economic terms, exploitative, and also we see that because of the the social power of the labor contractors, it was very difficult for anybody to resist the system, from within in the early years. So this is one aspect of, this is a, what we are seeing, what we can easily say see in this is the roughly from say till about say the late 1930s, this was the system continued without any major say disruption. And we can also, it may be profitable for us to say remind us about the Bombay cotton mills, where the role of the jobber was equally important. But jobber was basically a recruiter, but not much of a, it may not be a parallel to the gangster network dominated labor contract system in China. But jobber was also playing a parallel intermediary role in the context of, say, Bombay cotton mills. And this is the reason why, the early Chinese communist movement and labor movement opposed to the labor contracting. And in Anyuan major, the 1927-28 Anyuan Great Strike, led by Li Lisan and Liu Shaoqi, one of the key demands of the incipient Chinese communist say labor union was to end the labor contract system, and it was partly, not fully successful. And you will see the same thing happening in Shanghai, a little bit in say Tianjin, but we will see that by after the Chinese Revolution, the new Chinese government was able to control and say disintegrate this particular form of labor recruitment, and also so a labor contract as a labor system, they brought under control. Not only in the modern, say the socialist state sector, but we will see that if you look at the 1950s and 1960s through 1970, you will see, 1950s in particular, there was a series of incidents where the newly formed the Chinese, the Chinese trade union in every industry demanding more democratization, and to reduce and end the role of the labor contractors' role was, they survived into the post-revolutionary Chinese industries, but then came into conflict with the other, the Chinese, say, the Communist Labor Organization, and it took 10 years time for them to be completely defeated. And then in many cases, we had cases of, say, punishment, a few executions, and some of the we do have some reports. But what I'm saying, when Li Lisan formulated a new labor law for the Chinese industries, we see that their role has been completely been eliminated. But at the same time, if you look at the Chinese post-revolutionary agriculture sector, with the emergence of, say, 60s experiment of, say, communes and the rise of, say, production teams, production brigade, and also this aspect of, say, wage calculated in the form of, say, work point, and the way it was, say, transferred, we will see that a certain kind of a new exchange was taking place. It was not, there was no labor contractor, but at the same time, certain kind of a conditions, a contractual conditions was emerging. And with all the crises by mid 60s, everybody now we have, recognized that it seems, that Liu Shaoqi had argued very much for the restoration of a labor contract system. And we don't have some of the Liu Shaoqi's biography does mention and claim it as one of Liu Shaoqi's a contribution in the Chinese, Chinese labor to bring back, say, a labor contract system. But to cut the story short, till about 1970s, 1980, we see the role of the traditional labor contracting system as such of largely, come to an end, if not entirely eliminated, but as a social institution, it was completely controlled. But the story that I was more interested in is that why in the post-reform period, this system, returned to the Chinese labor relations when China began, say, most economic reforms, etc. And then it is that no surprising that the China, say, 1994, new national labor law, and it's when they reenacted in 2017 and updated later, they changed the very title of the law into the labor contract law. So China's labor law, the nationally unified labor law, is called the labor contract law. But the point I'm trying to say that throughout the post-reform era, we have China has introduced a series of new institutional norms and guidelines in place where it was much easier for labor flexibility to come back. And it was in this larger institutional milieu we see the rise of the return of the labor contractor. In fact, very much, especially I have studied the construction sector, and then we see that in construction, I have written a chapter on this in that book titled Beyond Regime. In construction sector, it is very clear. There is this majority of the workers in China's construction as well as this home renovation sector are all banded together by a powerful or a labor contractor who travel back to his countryside and talk to his village men, kinsmen, and others, and then ask them to join work in the in cities of be it in the Guangdong big industrial sectors or wherever, especially wherever there is this now the China say that a long period of construction has kind of losing its steam, but in 20 years this construction period went on, then you have very much the case. But the role of the labor contractor at the in that 20-25 years was slightly different. He was basically kind of gathering and assembling workers and bringing them to work in the urban sectors. And then what happened was that again the rural peasant workers tend to share affinity and trust with a social actor such as a labor contractor known to them. A parallel story that we have in Indian construction, where you have a taker there makes a similar kind of trips back to his villages and then assemble men and ask them to come back. And more interestingly, both in India and China, the entire that normative field, relating to wages and other things are agreed upon between the workers and the labor contractor in the villages. So that is the reason why both in India and in China, the existing regulatory norms do not intervene or disrupt this kinds of an arrangement. They have in Delhi, for example, Delhi government's statutory minimum wage is simply not applicable to the construction workers because the wage rates and all other work-related obligations, responsibilities are all agreed upon between the labor contractor and the workers back in the villages. And also we have other models such as the advance payment. In some cases workers are paid money in advance, and then so 55 days money will be a labor contractor will pay them 50 days of wages. They have to come to Delhi and work for 55 days, and the 5 days wage will be taken by the labor. But what is interesting in all this is what struck me is that the question, I was interested in what gave a coherence to this kinds of a system. Why this kinds of a largely voluntary, say, coming together of, say, workers takes place both in India and China. And then what gives them, say, stability, coherence, and resilience. In the sense, most of these workers are, say, working with the labor contractors, and their entire vocabulary they discuss with the labor is based on this kinds of, say, a kind of a trust. Similarly, is the case with it's China. In Chinese case, it is even more, say, serious a problem that a labor contractor demands 1 full year work, with him in the cities, and they'll be allowed to return back to the villages only during the Spring Festival. And the labor contractor will not pay these workers until they complete their 1 year, kind of a contract. It's a verbal agreement, an understanding, and these workers will be, say, working in Beijing and Guangzhou or Shanghai, wherever they are, for about 11-12 months, and then their entire annual the total wages will be paid only at the end of their the contract. And during the time of their work in the big city, they'll be provided dormitory accommodation and also some daily, some say expenses for the provision. So it is remarkable that to reflect upon all this, what we are seeing is that why if you compare both India and China, we see two things. One is that the traditional labor contract system, as we have kind of as I outlined earlier, it tried to survive into the Chinese industrial scene after revolution, but the Chinese say labor movement and the new communist say labor norms were entirely against them, and they were able to say largely control them. But with the reforms, it created a new a new normative and institutional field in place, which helped much of this to come back. And we have seen the rise of a traditional labor contract system in the early 20th century till about the 1940s, and then its decline. And then it much later, half a century later, it reviving. But in Indian case, the long history of labor contractors, from the colonial plantations to cotton mills to many cases, there is not much of a major rupture. They easily survived into the post-independence era, and then Indians labor legislations in the best of the progressive 1970s sought to control it by introducing legislation. We have a labor contract act, which is a prohibitory act, and India tried to do that. But at the same time, what is interesting in Indian case is that much of India's labor legislations or regulatory framework or other things are not intervening in the labor that comes into workers who come into work into these sectors. And why? Because a labor contractor who is so familiar to these workers, because of their like in China, they share a native place affinity. So interesting that culture or shared culture is providing some kind of a coherence and stability to this system, which it should have. And this culture is actually very, very traditional and very old. But it is more surprising is that the same system happened in case of China, where the native place affinity is even more pronounced. As those of us studying China all know that China from a very, very, very early period had native place associations, not only the guild associations, the native place associations, they were playing a very important role. And they used to help say people from same provinces, they can seek help whenever they come to the new city. And these kinds of native plus associations, say, Kinsmen affinity, many of these things were continuing in China. It was actually very strong in China, but which the 19 since 1950s the government tried to say disrupt, and there are accounts of how in the 60s the Chinese production teams in the rural agriculture, they try to avoid include members of same family in the same production team, so that in fact in China this is a very strongly shared a feeling, and whereas in India too, we have this kinds of a movement where a labor contractor familiar to a group of men who are workers and now family, many people are working with them, and then they enter into not only an agreement but also the entire negotiation between the workers and the labor contract takes place outside the modern labor, norms of the labor, legislations, labor laws, whatever you call. And what kind of say economic rationalities, that's the last, the question, one can think of, is now helping these system to come back. And now we also know that there are many writings now coming from not only from say India and China, but also from even from say Saskia Sassen's early study on the not only Saskia Sassen, there are a number of studies, even say immigrant workers in New York, workers in the working class neighborhood in Mexico, and Latin America. In many of these places, workers or labor is now getting more organized around a familiar, a kinship figure or something like that. It's a we have in Indian case we have so many such evidence, and somewhere the new economic rationalities we are now very familiar with is in fact to say encouraging this. How? Because majority of the say companies in the business, in their attempt to become lean organization, they are seeking seriously a separation between the business and the labor. So there is this was something which was the good, the 20th century Fordist era, that the direct employment by a company, that is now what we are witnessing. It appears that this new disjuncture that the today's capitalism introducing, that a separation between the social labor and capital, so that once you have labor, or assembly of say large number of workers, there are social costs, there are political costs. So you don't need to, and this is interestingly happening in even in China too. That's the reason why in Chinese case, and also it is interesting that how Indian story and the Chinese stories are compellingly parallel in case of labor. In China also over the last 7-8 years they have there is a new say actor on the labor scene, the labor dispatch companies. These labor dispatch companies are the real employer, and the roughly one estimate says that about 60 million Chinese workers are now are dispatch workers. Under a labor dispatch working system, a worker will be recruited and sent to work in a company, but the de facto employer will be the dispatch company, and the company where the worker actually contribute his or her labor will have no obligations. Even the wages are paid by the dispatch company. So, and similarly in Indian case also, we have seen now even the government sector, not only in private sector, even government sector, municipalities, even universities are now, now using a third-party intermediary for all kinds of recruitment of, to say, auxiliary staff, all kinds of, recruitment. So somewhere we are now seeing a new kind of a convergence where labor is, whatever in the good, part of the second half of the 20th century was able to achieve in terms of labor. And we are now seeing, say, serious challenges coming. And then, so interesting that culture actually provide conceptions of culture, conceptions of shared culture, kinship affinity, native places. All these are, we thought, will with the advent of a modern industrial society, some of this will be, if not entirely disintegrated, but declining. But we are seeing, on the contrary, these cultures are now providing very powerful, say, energies to, in labor mobilization, and also creating a new kinds of, say, sense of belonging, not to a class, but to their own kinship and native places, identity, etc., which will be easily used in, say, many of the modern sector. So let me just end by saying that although the old style violent labor contract is of the brotherhood of the Chinese context may have come to an end, or the Kanganis and Mistri, the Kanganis and Sardar may have disappeared in the context of, say, transnational labor migration. But we also see, labor, it's now becoming, into its, say, fragments of kinship, identity, and native places, which is now, greatly helping, say, our contemporary, contemporary capitalism to, and also, if this happens, if this kinds of, say, new institutional separation is achieved, then it is very difficult for workers both in India and China to, say, to think of a decent work and a better work. I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Suresh. Thank you very much. Household contract system and the labor contract system have contract in common, Chanpao. So contract is the vocabulary of reforms. But very interesting, Suresh, how custom and kinship prevail over socialist norms, or we didn't even discuss the trade union rights and so on, prevail over law. In other words, even though there is a law prohibiting certain things and guaranteeing minimum wage and so on, even that is bypassed by long-standing kinship ties and how they govern the labor contract system. Thank you very much. And your final comment on the, how class politics has gone to the background and kinship and shared culture drive the whole political economy. In this case, this is another example. Thank you very much. I think there are many, many interesting questions raised by your presentation. I will now invite P.K. Anand of the Institute of Chinese Studies to make his comments and ask a few questions. Anand.
Thank you, Professor Monty. Thank you, Dr. Suresh. It was fascinating, as always, with your presentations. Can you hear me?
Yes, Anand.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So it was fascinating, and especially moving from the petty contractor and the subcontractors, you moved to even third-party work supply firms. The transition and the economic logics or the new economic rationalities of capitalism, which you have very correctly pointed out, this making appearance, I mean, in India and especially in China, I mean, post reforms, that is, I mean, a lot of people see it as a surprise, but many people see it as a matter of fact now. I mean, it is also a kind of everyday logic of the state in China. So that's quite interesting. But I think just to carry forward from your point of intermediaries and how they are now a great external actor. I mean, even if you take the petty contractor and how native place affinities and identities are coming or coming into action, also shows which was my main point of asking. I mean, I would stick to only one question right now, is of the role of where the state has vacated itself. I mean, you have pointed out that very extensively in your chapter also on how the state has created this architecture of normative instrumentalities, and where there's a high concentration of laws and regulations, but or as some would call, I mean, it is a term which has also now come into recent in vogue, it's regulatory cholesterol. So there you have all these norms and you have all these, you have more and more laws, in fact. But when it comes to actually implementing or enforcing these laws, the state has abdicated or absolved its responsibility. So, but if I also look at it from this, especially since the pandemic has said to have visibilized workers and how their daily existence in the city has now come into focus, again, the role of the state has come into relief, and how the state ought to behave, or how the state needs to play the role of the enforcer. So, I mean, so my entire point is, I mean, although you seem to have this point that the state, both in India and also in China, the norm seems to be of absenteeing itself. I mean, I mean, inside China it has been selective, and in India it has been throughout. And also, if you read along it with it together, the role of the intermediaries, there seems to be the fact that the state also has limits. I mean, whether it could be the limits of societal actors or non-state actors playing a big role or overpowering the state, if I could use that term. I mean, just to quote Joel Migdal, who says that it's strong society and weak state. So, but can we at this moment see, if we could see the pandemic as a focus to see the role of the state or reimagine the state in the sense, so how state as a, I mean, if we could decenter the state from province level to make the cities as the form of administration. We integrate, because we have increasingly, we don't have integration between the labor governance and urban governance. So how do you, can we reimagine or reorient our vision or cognition of the state? I mean, is it possible? Because this is the new normal and we should see things also in a new lens. Will the state reconfigure itself, or will the state have a different role to play? I mean, I'm just restricting it to the construction or the informal sector. Of course, the third-party work supply firms and all that are big questions which needs to be answered. But can we have state and have localized solutions to big issues, especially in terms of daily lives of workers in the cities? I mean, can we reorient that self? Because I see Mukta Naik also, she's also here. I think Partha is here. They have also talked about this increasingly. And also the fact that there is a certain amount of distrust between both the state and the worker, how he sees the state and how the state sees the worker. So this amount of distrust, so can we have a local solution? And just to add one final point, I think you have been talking about labor contractors, and I think it's a constant he, because there is a clear gender dimension also to labor contractors. I mean, there is a constantly, you have used the word, I mean, you have used it as a he, whether it is in India or in China. So we also see a gender angle or a factor to this entire contractor as a social actor. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Anand. especially
Thank you,
about
Manu.
question about the state. Now, Rija Nair, also from ICS.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Suresh, sir, for a very fascinating talk. This is something that we were all waiting for to listen to from you. Sir, regarding the topic, you have mentioned how labor contractors, they play a very important role, not just in the process of recruitment, but also in the process of labor management at the work floor. You spoke about a more of a patron-client relationship between the workers and the labor contractors, etc. My first query is related to this particular social affinity that you have highlighted, that workers have with the labor contractors. What I'm more interested in knowing is, did it have any constraints on like a possible political constraints on this relationship had for the workers, especially in terms of placing political demands at the workplace? This is something that I'm interested in knowing, how it maybe shaped workers' protests and labor organization at the workplace, the kind of social affinity that workers had with the labor contractors. My second query is related to basically the kind of primary sources that you must have consulted for this particular topic. That is it from my end. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rija.
Next is Omi Daniel. Omi, please.
Thank you, sir, Dr. Manti, and this was really wonderful to listen to Dr. Suresh. After listening to Dr. Suresh, I think the traditional system is still exists, and also you have a social networking through which also the entire labor force is also guided, I think large number. I will actually particularly look into the precarious kind of employment which are in the bricklins in India. These are all debt migrants. Through an advanced system, people go, and this is a relationship between the labor recruiter who is also a money lender. So you have that kind of arrangement also in a labor recruitment process, and how they go to the interstate location. I would actually bring in the very interesting thing. Orissa was the first state to come up with a labor regulation, particularly the Dadan regulation and law. In Orissa, Dadan is actually a migrant labor. That's the connotation. And in 1975, before the Indian government could actually come up with the Interstate Migrant Workers Act, Orissa government actually formulated the Dadan Control and Regulation Act of 1975. And it's very clearly like what you said, the Sardars, the entire layers of the recruitment process which is taking place has been well recorded there. And now to cut short what actually I would like to say, now the Interstate Migrant Workers Act in Orissa, you can see, I think all 30 districts migrant laborers are registered at the district labor office, and maximum are at the western part where people are going to work in the bricklins. And somehow this law has been forgotten in India and many places, neither at the destination nor the source. It's a regulatory act. It's not a prohibitory act, Interstate Migrant Workers Act. And it actually came up influenced by the Odisha thing just to protect the migrant worker. Now the next thing, Dr. Mahanti also knows, now we are going into the next phase of abolishing this particular instrument, which was there at least to protect for the interstate migrant workers. So how do we see now? I think that's where I'm coming to. The labor codes are now coming back. The labor codes are taking into account all the, I think, the labor laws in India. And one of the labor laws also, the Interstate Migrant Workers Act, to dilute it. And the industry wants there should not be any law because that's ease of doing, and then the workers' right. I think these are two things when we see that migrant. Yeah. Lastly, how we see that now there are also labor arrangements. People are thinking about using apps, people have to register, and so the industry can recruit. This is the next level that in government these talks are going on. And there are also restrictions on certain labor laws, or not restriction, basically diluting labor laws to allow the industries to operate. So how do we see actually the post-COVID-19 situation when people have already started going back to the work? uh, anyway, so how we see that their rights are protected. Thank you, Dr. Manti.
Okay, thank you. I think all three are very interesting questions. You know, there is a precarious condition, a distress condition, which applies to a large number of labor who are subjected to this social practice, and the law is not able to protect them. Okay, now kindly respond, Suresh, to the three questions. The state.
Thank you, Anand, Rija, and Daniel. I'm so happy to meet you, Daniel. You know, we haven't met. I thank you, Professor Mohanty, for getting us connected. You see, one interesting thing, even when we reflect on, China, that about, I'm responding to Anand's question regarding the, the role of the state, put it in a historical perspective. You see that in the late 19th century and in early 20th century, the Chinese early capitalist industrial development was, say, spearheaded in part by the Qing bureaucrats, and later by the comprador and the foreigners, etc., etc. So the kind of a state that, that the labor contract system had to deal with was a very divided, state. It was like, state was a very local state. In Shanghai, if it is a Japanese controlled, cotton mill, it was, that was a state. So there was no state of, say, China as it exists in, say, in Shanghai for that matter. Even though, even in the Treaty Port era, you have, say, Shanghai city itself is divided by three powers: the Britain, United States, and China. So we have the, and France. So, but only after the revolution we have a unified state, and a state which is beginning to introduce, unified norms to regulate labor, industry, interaction. So, but in that way, the Chinese state was remarkably, successful in terms of, say, introducing its norms and ideas and practices to the people, especially the, the urban industrial workers, and to a great extent to the agricultural sector too. People know about the state norms, and this is a fascinating aspect about the Chinese, say, society and the socialist era. That dense interaction between the state and the people, the norms, ideas, and all kinds of things, that there was a transformative process. But compared to the India, we don't have that kind of a dense interaction between the state and the, and its norm with the workers. State exists very distant from, the labor capital, say, exchanges, and its sides. So that is one problem. But at the same time, you bring in this question of, say, if then in China you have a highly effective state, then why is it the state is failing? Why is it the state is retreating from the sites where it is supposed to, it is expected to come and introduce and, say, enforce its norms? So this is actually, I must say, this is very deliberate. The Chinese government deliberately wanted to encourage labor flexibilities. And it is creating institutional and normative conditions where these things can come back, these things can happen. And the Chinese, even, in Chinese newspaper, there has been, say, series of reports about, say, black-hatted, labor contractors, they called it Hei Pao Kun Tao. And then what happened was only one chief power made an emotional appeal once, because many of the workers did not, there was a huge problem with wage arrears. Workers were not even paid their, wages. There were cases of suicide, conflict, everything. But still, the Chinese state didn't step in, except to one or two, cases, and local municipalities trying to come and, pay their money. So locally, solutions are taking place in, because of municipalities coming in and etc. But in Indian case, it is again very difficult, because there is majority of the Indian rural workers, they are there, they do not possess much of a power, because unlike China, migration in India in many cases is the unit of migration is not a worker but a family. You have an entire family migrating from, say, rural areas to urban sectors, routed through a contractor. So in that context, people more tend to think in terms of, they don't think in terms of, worker right, wage issues, and etc. But they try to bargain with the labor contractor for whatever thing they are taking on. And lastly, to my, I have only come across mainly say male, cases of say male labor contractors. Even when women workers were recruited in Shanghai, they were basically by men. Even in India, majority of the labor contractors that I have come across are say, but I read about some of the women say labor entrepreneurs who are say bringing together women as a collective, under some Kerala Kudumbashree project, but it's not a big example, for us. To respond to Reja's question, it is not always. It's a patron-client, relationship. In the context of Anyuan, Kailuan mines, and many cases, especially, and also in the transport sector, the labor contractors were very, very powerful, often violent, agents who have the full protection by the brotherhood societies of this green gang, elder brother societies in a Shanxi area. So the kind of say, and they were the state actually, they were the extremely powerful, very formidable organizations lending support and protection to the labor contractors. And even the factory management would think twice before say, picking any say trouble with the contractors, and it did lead to the political constraints on the workers because of it is impossible in the early period to challenge the power of the labor contractors, and as a result you have in Anyuan mines majority of the workers also took membership in the LW society. They became sworn brothers in the very society. Actually, Elizabeth Perry's that book has provided very, very fascinating accounts about how workers went through all kinds of rituals to join, the so-called Red Gang. There are initiation process, there are rituals, and you become part of the LW society. Your identity is as a brotherhood identity. You are part of the very gangster system. You control, and the same gangster control all the same. For prostitution, streets in many of these say working class cities. So everything. So it's a very, 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 very. And the sources that I have used, this. I was just telling Professor Birthanga that in Cornell Asia Collections there is the Contractors library. They have I got a majority of the. The primary source, if you look at the labor history, the 1950s, witnessed a very, a great revival of, say, documentation of labor history by the Chinese scholars who traveled to many of these places and compiled, volumes of, say, they conducted interviews and they generated volumes and volumes of say labor history. But there, I have able to get hold of some of this from the, in case of mines, in case of say, cotton mills. But at the same time, they were written from a perspective. They were written from a, the communist labor activism perspective. So they sometimes overemphasize, certain emotions. So there are problems with the rhetoric, etc. But that is the one source of primary sources we have. Otherwise, we have, Kailuan mine is well documented. And I have got some studies, and also, Kailuan wage system, labor contracting system is, they have a great archive, and some of the things are already appeared in Chinese Economic Society translations, some time ago. In India, we have
it's
that.
16 hours.
Yeah.
Okay, 16 hours. Okay, that's okay. All right. I think, Suresh, let's take some
Yeah, the
questions.
last point to Daniel. I checked the new labor codes. Although it's still debating. It has not been introduced to Parliament. So labor codes are not. Again, labor codes is also introducing this. This idea that no direct employment. I had looked at the industrial, code in some details, but I don't know what is the new version that the government is now. Even BMS is opposed to it. The labor codes are so controversial. Even BMS is very much, opposed to. Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for other details that you have, given.
Thank you. I don't see any raised hand. I should have mentioned that you can go down in the participants list to that more sign and raise hand, but you can also physically raise hand and I will call you. But there are 2-3 questions. Let me take from the chat box and put before you. A very interesting question is from Ambassador Saurabh Kumar. Why has the CCP had a blind eye to this whole regressive system? And then there is a question on the impact of hukou. How does the contractor handle the hukou condition? A third question is, isn't there now the digital platform available for all industries and various recruitment processes? Is that used or misused? And there is a very interesting question on the Kerala experience, Kutumbasri. Isn't Kutumbasri a method of an alternative use of labor, getting labor through self-help groups and relieving the state of the load to organize it directly or through systems like the labor contractors? Why don't you take these first?
Yeah, we see easily that how CPC has moved far away from, what makes the big difference between the CPC of today and the CPC of, say, the central planning era in China was that at that time, much of China's development was focused on the human needs, like to say rescue people from poverty, and also create more enabling conditions for human life. And now we know that the Chinese government, I have been searching for some leads to say that how much of China's current developmental orientation is focused on human needs, and the human needs have been completely sort of abandoned in Chinese government's developmentalist thinking. They're all for, say, a highly capital intensive, energy intensive, big, impressive, kind of as a project. So therefore, I am not very surprised that why the Chinese government has not much interest in addressing, say, serious labor issues such as wage arrears, which has actually happened in China, and also low wages. In a construction sector, wages are much lower, and only in recent years in Guangdong, the factory cities, the wages are going up. And some 10-15 years ago, even a security guard used to get only about 800 RMB per month. So, I see this as a general, orientation. The new economic rationalities that the Chinese government today wanted to introduce, and they have accepted. It takes them away from all these concerns, and then and also they wanted to have a disciplined, China where investment can come back. They wanted to have a disciplined, they don't want, but at the same time, again, it is interesting for that the China witnessed more labor protest, than India. It is also another interesting factor. And hukou, how the labor contract system in 90s and subsequent years, what happened was because of the hookah, it again became an exploited system because for a rural peasant workers to come to work in urban sectors, they have to get a series of permissions from many of the local government, from say labor bureau to so since they don't have the hookah, this is a series of a permission regime, approval regime, where the a labor contractor or a construction company have to pay some money, and this license fee, approval fee, all kinds of fees, they then collect from the workers. So what happened was that because of this hookah, or peasant workers not having hookah, it also became an avenue for say rent seeking for the Chinese government. That's what happened. And digital platform, usually much of this networking happens through digital platforms, but not in a unified manner. But Chinese workers and others are also very adept in using digital say platform, even to avoid not much government, but by the they can organize, and their payment is now done by say WeChat payment. And there are many. So a technology interface have come in a big way, in Chinese, even in the life of construction workers. So Kudumbashree needs to be. It's an interesting question that why Kudumbashree sounds nice. Self-help group also. It sounds. Nice, and those women who are part of this, they have a an identity. They have a many of the things are happening. But to and it's very enabling. I can see those points, but at the same time, the government should not leave say self-help group to organize labor themselves. I have not studied Kudumbashree or this seriously, but I think it is also we have to ask critical questions about Kudumbashree, Kudumbashree itself. After some 10 years, what happened to the Kudumbashree members? It is important to trace their biography, and then what happened. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Before we take up more from the chat box, may I request Professor Bridge Tankha to ask questions or make a comment. Bridge, please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Suresh. That was very nice and interesting topic. I was just thinking about the whole system of contract labor and its resurgence. And, in the pre-independence movement in India or pre-49 China, it was the, coolie labor and the penal contracts which were castigated by the nationalists, critiqued, and it was pretty central to the discourse then of attacking the system as unfair and needing for reform. And it was also seen as a sort of leftover from pre-modern times. It wasn't modern, it wasn't part of the capitalist system. But as you see, and as you've been talking, and the way capitalism is organized is also quite different, and it changes. There's no one model. That's around, a lot of the debates are really focusing around that question. So in that sense, as Tirthankar Roy, for instance, who's written on jobbers and stuff like that, raises a question, what is the institutional response to an economic problem? Why is contract labor used? So it's not the specific issues about how it's organized and so forth, but why does it become important in economic systems? That is a question that should be investigated. And as you've seen, whether it's China or India or the US and Europe, they all, and Japan had contract systems today. And for instance, certainly with the intensification of neoliberal economics, you see the rise of recruitment agencies. which are another form of contract labor, they become some of the biggest companies. Like in Japan, Recruit and Persona, they're just not Japanese companies, they're global companies with huge revenues and manpower because they provide contract labor, they pay the labor. So in some ways, it shields the state from the regulation that the states had created to protect labor. It allows, transgressing these regulations. So for instance, you find in Europe, you'll find farm labor recruited by contractors because they don't need to pay them the basic wage. They can house them in substandard holes in the ground sometimes, actually. I mean, it's a big problem. And there's something to do with the economic system, which is and the type of the nature of the state, which allows this. That's one issue. And the other is this whole question of, so how do we think of the growth of capitalism? Because if certain types of organization should die out and new forms of organization, should be coming up, whereas we see that they're not, you get these pre-modern informal groupings going on. So I think that's one area which I think would be interesting to explore, because you see it, as I was talking to you about in Andrew Liu's book, in the organization of tea plantations in China and India. You have contract labor and so forth. So even at one level, it's under very draconian laws, but it's under the sort of modern colonial system that it's imposed. So anyway, these were just some ideas which I...
want to respond, Suresh? Or?
Yeah. I mean, this is important to investigate as to why it is used. And also, for me, we had actually that in the post-war era, this great strides, at least in Europe, that this is important, that even though it was a political consensus, most European countries, that how important is labor, work, dignity, etc. And they know the great legislations, all that happened, and also on others, on the North Atlantic region, the rise of Fordism also introduced in a way better say idea of organizing work and labor. It created a new middle class, but now the question is most of the as I mentioned, big corporations are wanted to become increasingly becoming lean organizations, and they don't want to have a capital investment in any factory, warehouse, even labor. So this is a capitalist a new tendency to highly say not only simply becoming lean organization, but maybe because of the new the technology helps them a lot, and completely dispense with the social forms of labor. They can do it without that. And even within large organizations, only a tiny fraction of the total employment is regular employment. So this is happening within in Europe, in United States, and then eventually it will come here, and then in India, very enthusiastically adopting to all this. So it is very much a change in the very very organization of say the industrial, and of course there is no industrial, and also this moving away from what is called the industrial. There is a new idea that if you to make money, you don't need to practically, you don't need to start anything. So we have a much less investment coming. So it is a new it's a new juncture, and then.
Sorry, what I was thinking about was that actually where industry can move out of the country to seek low-wage areas to produce their goods, garment exports goes to Bangladesh or things like that. then the host country's regulations are weak, so they can give low wages and bad working conditions and so forth, but which they can't do in the home country. But in the areas where they can't move production out, like farms, for instance, you can't take your farm and do the farming elsewhere because you need to support that population. So one way is subsidies. The other way is contract labor, because the contract labor passes on the burden of maintaining standards to the contractor. And then the level of enforcement seems to fall because they do it occasionally. So anyway, so sorry.
Yeah, okay. Shall we take up some more questions? Suresh, there are three interesting questions from the chat box and one from Savikas. The Savikas question is, are there women labor contractors and do they act differently?
Okay.
And okay, why don't you answer that if you want? Then I will, because the other two questions are international migration.
Okay.
Yeah. For example, a lot of Chinese labor now go to other countries.
Yeah.
Latest being Australia, of course, Africa. Yeah. They have been to Iran, Vietnam, and so on. So, does the same labor contractor system work in China's international migration?
Okay.
Yeah, that's one. The other is whether the big companies now have professionalized the contract system to such an extent that there is, of course, a full utilization of the, Tungpang, Tungxiang, and all that. I mean, the Kinsmen network, but it is far more organized in the modern way in terms of registration. The labor supervisor office of the company of the state has data about that. Now, if that is working for the international migration, in case that is working, and I suspect it works for the international migration, does it work for, I mean, is it beginning to operate also in the internal migration?
It's beginning to?
Operate in internal, contract labor system. In other words, this professionalization of the contract labor system. The old kinship related informal mobilization and agreement to this, to the sort of bureau regulated big company registration intervening.
Okay.
Take these three first.
Yeah, about the women labor contractors, both in the Chinese labor history, and also in the subsequent literature, I haven't come across any active role of the women labor contractors.
Okay, so it's a patriarchal system. Okay,
but at the same time, there is a gender aspects very, very interesting. Imagine the 1930s Shanghai cotton mills where Japanese preferred more, say, women workers for some reason, and then that idea diffused to other management, and then British and Chinese started employing more, say, women workers. And when they employed, and Emily Honig said that when they recruited women workers, they recruited mainly from women workers from a particular impoverished region, the Supe region, and there used the extremely impoverished. Culturally, according to their idea, inferior, kind of a population, and brought in. Of course, there is a transformative process, but the labor contractors are mainly men, but they have at the same time, when they were provided temporary accommodation, there are women who are kind of matrons and things like that to control their life a little bit. And also, if you see the Chinquan Li studies on the Shenzhen and Hong Kong, a labor organizer. I mean, actually, there are women labor organizers, both in Shanghai cotton mills, and subsequently we see many, instances of say, women becoming labor organizers, and then also participating in a great labor strikes. But not, I mean, I had to really search for, check that, aspect. And on the international, say, labor, because this is interesting part. See, now it seems that this historical, say, process, back and forth, and the whole historical, development is easily, say, deriving earlier models. So now we have a transnational labor mobilities of the Chinese workers, to many places, but they'll be using either the early Qing era. I mean, they're already, because Chinese labor is actually well spread over, from, say, even from the early, late Qing era, they went to, say, California, Africa, many places, Hawaii and all that. And there is a great deal of, but that kind of, say, movement was not always rooted through a labor contractor, but they used all kinds of connections, and of course there was an agency, some agency, but the labor, the agency system is now there, and once in a while you will see the government of China giving new guidelines as to these are the new regulations regarding labor who say who are going up. But this is also, I have not really studied well. Pyongyang has, I mean, they have been working on this aspect. And the last point about the professionalization of what I have looked at is mostly about the the sectors where these kinds of a labor contracting system is getting kind of concentrated, fragments of rural labor brought through by a contractor using the kinship identity and others, and then it remained very coherent, and it has the resilience and etc. But when it comes to big corporations, it becomes I mean, we can actually say that, say, as we now know, most of the banking sector and other sector, they have the system of a team leader. You have to work with again, there are new cultural norms are in place to keep the workers in discipline, and remain a work more coherent. It's in the information sector, and we know that in South India, in the early phase of information technology, that growth, the early growth period, recruitment had a kinship coming into big play, appointment and recruitment through say personal contact, etc. So it may have happened, but to what extent the professionalization? I think these are all areas which we needed more, say, empirically grounded investigation. So I have not, since I have not done much that. So
yeah. Okay. Thank you, Partha, Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay, and after that Anand.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mukhopadhyay.
Yes, Partha, please.
I was just curious about the variation in the labor contract system today, and how far, as Professor Suresh is saying, it's actually being used among today's migrants. Is it, for example, used more in the construction sector, like, for example, in India, and Azumi has already spoken about veterans, or is it also used in other kinds of manufacturing activities, so to speak, right? And then, if so, what kinds of manufacturing activities is the lower end, higher end kind of stuff? The second is with respect, there are no women labor contractors, but since there are a large number of women workers in China, and women migrant workers in China, is there, do these kinds of systems also apply to women workers rather than, or is it that it largely moves with men, and therefore and if so, does that work differently? And two other quick things. One is whether, over time, as these migrants sort of, let's say the first year of work and the second year of work, they're there, but over time, do they become in some sense more independent of these kinds of, so do the kinship networks sort of ensure that they remain tied in some fashion? So there is that tension between conscription and kinship that I'm sort of trying to understand. And finally, does it also, is it largely true for distance, or is it work for living for long distance migrants?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Suresh, let's take all the questions together. Anand, before Anand comes, there is a question from the chat box. Swarnamay Tripathi asks, where is the labor contractor placed in the social hierarchy of China? The social status of labor contractors.
Okay.
Then we have, okay, now Anand.
Sorry, I'll be very brief. Actually, I was very interested in, I could not push that in my initial part of my question, is that what Dr. Suresh pointed out towards the end of his presentation in terms of new forms of contracting emerging, especially third-party work supply firms. And it covers not just the petty contractor. I mean, it's at a very big level. And you just mentioned that various institutions and how, so even governments, I mean, now there has been an outsourcing of knowledge and thinking and getting help, external help of external agencies. And some of them are very big consultancy firms. But the problem, more of that is also this, actually these all firms seem to work in gray area. In the gray area, there is no transparency. I mean, as far as how they are recruited, who recruits them, how do they exactly locate which person to recruit? And it always seems to be playing out. There is this fuzziness about the principal employer as well. I mean, right now, the point to discuss this is also is about the kind of political storm that's happening in Kerala in terms of how a lot of external consulting firms have been hiring people through backdoor. And that seems to have created this entire opaque system of, and the inability to identify who actually the employer is. And there is a buck passing which happens. So, I mean, the new economic rationale and economic logics and the new capitalist logic have brought outsourcing as a big level. And it's not just at firm level, but you even have governments which have completely outsourced their activities or their governance. I mean, outsourcing of governance. In fact, it's a point which.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Suresh, you'll have the last word, but I'll just say a couple of sentences. Professor Wanthichun heads, or he has initiated a countrywide cooperative, workers' cooperative movement, mainly rural cooperatives. And one of their points of campaign is how to protect the rights of migrant labor. In the morning, I was wearing that t-shirt, labor is glorious, Lautung Pongming. And so I think there is a debate about the rights of migrant workers and how, among other things, the contract labor system is impinging on that right. In Ushi, I noticed two things. The labor which came from northern part of Jiangsu and other places to work in Ushi, the local government in the northern part, in their original place, and the local government here where the company or the farms are located, they had an agreement also. So local government, and the latest is that party cadres and party committees, which are now entering all spheres, they're also connected in many places in order to see that the migrant labor is not exploited. But because the labor contractor is not wholesome in its responsibility, they do part of their job and then they forget. It's not the earlier patrimonial full care system anymore, even in China. Therefore, are there some new systems emerging to neutralize some of the ill effects of the contract labor system.
Yeah.
Final words from you. We have run out of time. You take 2 minutes.
Yeah. To Professor Partho's questions, there exists. I mean, my initial premise was that there exists a great variation in sectors where labor contract system is prevalent and sectors which is shy of from this. But now we are seeing, as in the last 1 decade, a growing tendency within industry, across industries to I think this is even in the case of even in Seattle, that certain kind of cultural affinity is important to keep workers together, so they don't make it too much of a movement. So now it seems that not labor contract system as such, but a derivative of that system, in which you have a non-economic, organizational conceptions are coming into big play in, say, getting workers. I have heard of stories that as to why, say, Indian software engineers are given, preferred in the United States. Is one reason is that they'll stick, with the one, say, for a long time, compared to the local American workers. So there are, these ideas, and it is coming. But of course, it is only in the labor contract system in its original, say, form, exists more in the sectors like construction and home renovation and a few other sectors. I mean that which I would know. Yeah, but the women workers, it seems that many of the studies and some anecdote that we have, they tend to become more that transcendental, kind of an impulse is more among women. They move out of their, say, provincial, say, affinity groups and etc. They can, instead of like a search one workers always socialized, socialize among themselves, go to the same, search. Women workers used to be, like their sense of mobility is very different, but where men tend to go more about their own, say, kinsmen. That I don't know. I mean, I have attended some of this, in a kinsman restaurant visit, but this is something that we need to, we need to look at. The last point, Professor Partho, I didn't clearly hear you because the voice was about the kinship you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I was basically asking whether, as workers sort of stay on in the city for 3-4 years, the relationship with the contractor still remains. Now, usually what happens is once a worker develops his own social network, then that relationship weakens. But then you mentioned issues of kinship, which can then still retain that relationship. So I was wondering how these two factors were sort of playing out. I mean,
I got it.
Yeah.
In the second exam, it is very clear that a rural peasant worker come to the city only through a labor contractor. Without a labor contractor, it is impossible for. This is the case, very much the case in say, for example, Delhi and in Beijing and other cities, recently, because somebody has to be an enabler to process, that make that transition. And in case of Delhi, without a labor contractor, a worker will not get access to even a shanty house or a slum quarter, because everything is very much, say, assigned to labor contractors and etc. etc. So I don't know whether that exactly may exist in the same degree in China, but as you saying, there could be like a possibility of, say, workers having more, say, local social contact and and moving out. And the last points about the the social hierarchy of the labor contractors. I found a very interesting anecdote in the in a study by a Cornell young scholar conducted in Beijing, in which she two of her say interviews she conducted with the labor contractors. They had OD cars and they had lots of money. they were, they could invite say visiting researcher to high-end restaurants and etc. They had just lots of money. Labor contractors in China, they are seen as a really big good entrepreneurs making money, whereas Indian labor contractors, many of them whom I met in Delhi, many of them are like a little worker entrepreneurs. They are little better than a worker. They don't have a, the only capital they have is the money advanced by the company. Otherwise, they don't have much money. They also struggle a lot. And very few labor contractors actually make a money out of this so-called business. They also just make a living. So that is actually very, very contrasting. But in China, labor contractors have their economic power and a social clout. Not, I don't know, many of them, and many of these black card labor contractors who ran away with all the money. Some of them may have got into trouble, but yeah. So yeah, but Anand, yes, exactly. Now this is the whole point. Who is your employer? Now it is becoming, in more and more cases, we have more evidence, more cases before us that it is increasingly becoming, like pretty much most part of the world, like even say not only Mexico, the maquiladora system, everywhere. Who is your employer is something that be it third party, say intermediary or consultancy firm or outsourced firm or China's labor dispatch system. In all these cases, workers are today working, but they do not know whom they are working for. And they don't have an employer to fight against, make wage demands. So this is a big problem.
To conclude, Suresh,
Yeah.
conclude in a couple of sentences.
No, I can complete. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
All right. So thank you very much. And in the context of COVID, we could discuss even more. For example, we were told that now the companies are desperately dependent on these labor contractors to get labor back to these places and not fully successful. That is also the report. Thank you very much. I think this is a dimension. It was well covered, and thanks a lot. And thank you all for those very interesting questions, very searching questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you also for arranging this.